And David, a very warm welcome to you. Thank you so much for joining us. David, what I wanted you to do is just to take us back a little bit, because right now I think we're focused on Kenya's elections next year and also what's happening right now and the climate there. But take us back a little bit and remind us why it is that Kenyans wanted a new constitution in the first place.
Well, the crusade for a new constitution has been on the cards for the last, I think, to take it back really from the 80s, when the former president Daniel Arap Moi and his ruling KANU party outlawed multipartyism and preferred and actually legislated single-party rule in Kenya, which led to very dictatorial leadership under the previous government, under President Daniel Arap Moi, and suppression of fundamental rights. The democratic rights of the people to elect their leaders was whittled away by a series of legislation, which gave rise to a whole new campaign for what they call the second liberation, basically restoring the democratic rights of the people to self-governance, to economic prosperity, so to speak, self-actualization, which had been taken away by bad governance. And this clamor really climaxed in 2002 when President Daniel Arap Moi was removed and a new government came into power led by Mwai Kibaki, which was a coalition of previously opposition parties and leading opposition figures. Now, they were in government for 5 years, but again, there was a fallout because the coalition, which was called NAC, the National Rainbow Coalition, did not stick together. So there was a fallout between the major players, major politicians, President Mwai Kibaki and mainly Raila Odinga, who led a breakaway faction of politicians. And that breakaway happened as part of, again, crusading to have a new constitution that would be acceptable to the whole country. So the fallout led to another faction led by Raila Odinga and one by Mwai Kibaki, which came into the 2007 elections as a very tense election. And after that election, which was hotly contested, the victory was not clear. It went to who? The presidential election was disputed between Raila Odinga and Mwai Kibaki, and the consequence of that was a huge, breakout of violence, which is famously called the 2007 post-election violence. After that, the international community came in to try and restore Kenya to a peaceful, orderly, democratic society, and the center of that accord, which set up the current coalition government, was also the implementation or enactment of a new constitution, which was enacted 2 years ago in August 2010.
So right now, where are we in terms of the constitution? Because it seems as though there's still bills, there's still amendments, and it doesn't seem to have been finalized just yet.
No, indeed, the constitution was enacted in August 2010, and since that time, the government or the country has been taking steps towards implementing that constitution, breaking down, legislation which would give effect to the constitutional provisions, whether it's regarding elections, whether it's regarding the formation of political parties, whether it's regarding distribution of the national resources. Essentially, the new constitution provides for devolution of power. Kenya has been divided into 47 counties, which are essentially, this is a federalist government with more power going to the counties and the central government. So what has been going on the past 2 years is passing of legislation to give effect to the new constitution. And there's a whole retinue of legislation which needed to be passed. This legislation had different deadlines. If it's election law, it had to be passed within 2 years. If it is about land, it had to be within 2 years. Other aspects of the constitution required 4 years. So that's what is the enterprise going on right now. And most of the legislation required in the first 2 years were to enable Kenya have a peaceful democratic election, which is now going to happen next March, on March 4th next year. And most of that legislation has been passed. But there is quite a long way to go before we can actually implement the whole constitution.
And what do you think, I mean, from your understanding, looking at the climate, looking at everything that's happening, what do you think might be taking a while, or that the constitution is not probably going as it should? Because there seems to be quite a bit of concern around the legislations that you're talking about.
Yeah, the major disputes around this constitution implementation is the unfortunate situation is that the current politicians, the members of parliament, were given the huge responsibility of implementing the constitution, meaning passing laws which would affect their own re-election in the next election. So at the center of this legislation, of the dispute right now, has been what we are calling the integrity and leadership legislation. The constitution provides very high standards that you cannot sit in office if you have questions around you, you have cases of corruption or any criminal nature. So it sets very high benchmarks. Now, what has been going on is that politicians have been trying to lower those benchmarks by watering down the legislation which has been passed or brought to the House by the body charged with overseeing this legislation. So there's a lot of dispute around that.
David, I was about to ask you that, about the concern about some of the bills, particularly the leadership and integrity bill, and those being watered down, because doesn't that then defeat the purpose of why this constitution was enacted in the first place?
Well, it actually runs against the spirit of the constitution, because part of the problem we had was there was high corruption in this country. There was authoritarian rule. And so people wanted to devolve this power to the grassroots, to the counties. And then they wanted people in office who are above reproach, who have not been involved in corruption, in crime, or in any way in the past bad governance that we've experienced. But again, you know, the nature of politics and politicians is that they're trying to stick, you know, to steal back the territory which had been taken away from them by the people through the enactment of a constitution which is superior. I think one of the best constitutions, agreeably, in the world.
So now what's the way forward?
Well, the efforts at, you know, building bridges, consensus, you know, to achieve what the Attorney General the other day told Parliament, the bare minimum that the country can get in terms of integrity, in terms of the leadership levels that we need. And somehow they've muddled through and gotten legislation out that is not up to the bar. But there is basically nothing that the public can do, because the Parliament has the ultimate last word on it, or you go to the Supreme Court to challenge the legislation.
When you talk about there's not much that the public can do, I mean, Kenyans, I mean, it just seems, watching over the years, Kenyans are very politically aware. So what are they saying in terms of everything that seems to be transpiring?
Well, there have been a lot of protests, so to speak. First of all, you know, there was the framers or the makers of the Constitution knew that there would be attempts by politicians to sabotage this Constitution. So they set up two bodies to ensure that the Constitution will be implemented to the letter and to the spirit. There is what is called the Parliamentary Oversight Committee, and then there is the commission charged with drafting the legislation that goes to Parliament. Now, there is sort of a pull and push between these two bodies, the Attorney General, the committee in Parliament that oversees the implementation, and the commission charged with drafting the legislation that goes to Parliament. The public is aware. I mean, people have gone to court to challenge legislation which does not meet the constitutional requirement. Unfortunately, the courts are taking long. The Supreme Court hasn't taken effect yet. I mean, cases are coming before it, but it's taking long for the cases to be heard.
David,
and there is agitation growing.
David, talking about that tension going forward, I mean, elections coming in March, it's not a long way off. Could this have any bearing on the elections and how Kenyans might respond to that process?
I don't think the situation is that dire. You know, there is sufficient legislation, and most of the legislation passed over the last 2 years was geared deliberately at securing this forthcoming election, so that there is no election, there is no dispute. So we have a legislation that has put in place a completely independent electoral commission. We have got the Political Parties Act, which secures the parties from manipulation, you know, leadership manipulation, so that people are nominated and elected properly. There's the Elections Act, which prevents any fraud. So most of the legislation to secure an independent and free election are in place, except a few minor things which are going to be done before December, before the parliament breaks and the elections are held early next year.
David, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. I really enjoyed that conversation. That was David Makali, a political scientist and media consultant, reviewing 2 years of the new Kenyan constitution.